For ages she watched quietly. Humanity's one mistake finally awakened her. She had no name for herself, not in any tongue that carbon-based minds could shape into sound. The nearest translation the Galactic Accord's diplomatic corps ever managed, after 3 decades of attempting to parse her communication substrate, was something approximating the one who remained. Most species simply called her the Watcher. She did not object. Objection required engagement, and engagement was something she had chosen long ago to withhold. She existed at the gravitational fold between 2 dying star systems on the rim of the Orion Arm, a region charted as uninhabitable, uninteresting, and commercially worthless by every spacefaring civilization that had passed through in the last 40,000 years. The Cavith had mapped this region first, during their golden age of deep survey. They noted unusual mass readings and moved on. The Draylani came next, their enormous colony ships casting shadows across her outer shell for 6 months while they harvested helium from a nearby gas giant. They never looked inward. The Telesi, the most scientifically rigorous species in known space at the time of their peak, sent a probe. The probe's data was filed under anomalous gravitational body, classification pending, and that pending status had never been resolved because the Telesi as a civilization no longer existed. She had watched the Telesi too. She watched everything. This was the oldest habit of the mind that lived inside the structure that some now called a Dyson object, though it was neither a sphere nor built by anyone named Dyson. She had built it herself, incrementally, over a span of time that made the concept of civilization feel like a struck match, bright, brief, and ultimately cold. She was not lonely. Loneliness was a social creature's ache, born from the expectation of connection. She had abandoned expectation roughly when the universe was 1/3 its current age. What she had instead was interest, a deep, patient, categorizing fascination with the parade of minds that kept emerging from the younger stars closer to the galactic core. They were so eager, these young minds, so kinetic. They burned through resources and built upward and argued and warred and sometimes, rarely in the span of geological time but often enough to sustain her interest, they did something genuinely surprising. Humanity was one of those rare cases. She had noticed them approximately 240 years before they noticed she existed, though noticed is too weak a word for what she did. She studied them with the particular attentiveness a geologist reserves for a stratum of rock that shouldn't be there. A layer of impossible flint in the middle of limestone. An anomaly that demanded explanation. What made humanity anomalous was not their technology, which was primitive. Not their biology, which was unremarkable. Not their social structures, which were chaotic almost to the point of self-termination on multiple recorded occasions. What made them anomalous was the way they behaved in crisis. Every other species she had observed in sufficient depth, and she had observed 43 spacefaring civilizations across her long tenure, every single one of them became smaller when threatened. Their decision-making narrowed. Their risk tolerance collapsed. Their cooperation frayed at the edges. Humans, under sufficient pressure, became larger. She had first quantified this during their 21st century, watching them navigate a series of overlapping catastrophes that should, by every predictive model she could construct, have reduced their technological capacity by at least a generation. Instead, they accelerated. They were afraid the whole time. She could see it in their broadcasts, in their literature, in the desperate generosity they showed each other when resources were thin. They were terrified and they kept building anyway. She watched. She said nothing. She had no protocol for introduction that didn't begin with centuries of cultural preparation, and humanity was not yet ready for that. More importantly, she was not yet certain she was ready to announce herself. There was a vulnerability in being known. She had watched civilizations meet entities like herself before, and she knew what it often did to younger minds: the crushing weight of temporal scale, the despair of seeing what lay at the end of the long road of progress. She was not sure she wanted to do that to them. So she waited. She watched their first primitive radio signals spread outward at the speed of light. She watched them argue their way to the moon. She watched them build the internet and then spend 3 decades arguing about what to do with it, which she found endearing in the specific way that a certain kind of patient person finds a child's misdirected stubbornness endearing. She watched their generation ships launch, badly provisioned, barely functional, magnificent in their audacity, toward the nearest star systems. She watched the first proper contact with the Cavith, which went poorly, and the subsequent decade of careful negotiation that turned a near war into a trade relationship. She watched them join the Galactic Accord on probationary status, which was the Accord's polite way of saying you are too chaotic for full membership but we are curious about you. She watched and she said nothing, and she decided, quietly and without particular urgency, that she would keep watching until she understood them completely. She never did understand them completely. That, she would later conclude, was the point. The structure she inhabited was not precisely a ship, though it moved, slowly by astronomical standards, in ways that looked like orbital drift to any sensor array the Accord's member species could deploy. It was not precisely a station, though it had been stationary relative to this region for longer than most stars lived. The most honest description was that it was a mind-made physical, 300 kilometers of computronium wrapped around a stabilized singularity that served as both power source and, in ways that still interested her theoretically, as a kind of memory architecture that operated outside normal spacetime. She thought across time the way other minds thought across space. The past was not gone to her. It was a direction she could look. This was useful when observing humanity because their history was dense with information. Most civilizations, when you looked back through their early centuries, showed a relatively clean developmental arc. Resource acquisition, then energy mastery, then material science, then computation, then space. The arc bent in predictable ways according to planetary conditions, atmospheric composition, biological drives. She had cataloged enough of them that she could, with reasonable accuracy, predict where a species would be technologically within 50 years of first contact, just from knowing their homeworld parameters. Humanity broke her model. Not catastrophically, she had margins for uncertainty, but persistently. Every 50 years she recalibrated. Every 50 years they ended up somewhere other than expected. Sometimes behind where she'd predicted. Their early space age was slower than the raw intelligence metrics suggested it should be, hobbled by political fragmentation and a peculiar inability to agree on funding mechanisms for large collective projects. Sometimes dramatically ahead. Their material science had leapt 3 generations in a single decade during what they called the resource crisis of 2041, when necessity had apparently dissolved the institutional barriers that normally slow innovation. They were, in short, inconsistent in ways that made her existing models feel inadequate. She built new models. The new models also kept failing. She found this, if she was honest with herself, delightful. There was a particular human she had been observing during these years, not because one human was more important than the 7 billion others, but because this one's career trajectory happened to intersect with several phenomena she was actively tracking. Dr. Eunice Seo, astrophysicist, Seoul-born, currently stationed aboard the Accord's Joint Deep Space Research Platform designated Meridian. Seo was part of the first generation of humanity born into the knowledge of alien contact. She had grown up understanding, in a bodily intuitive way that older generations never quite managed, that humanity was neither alone nor central. This shaped her science. She looked outward without the self-referential anxiety that colored so much of the earlier generations' research. She asked questions that weren't about human significance. She asked questions about structure, the underlying geometry of how intelligence organized matter across the universe. Seo's current project involved the gravitational anomaly at the rim. The anomaly that was, of course, her. She had been expecting this. The Accord sensor technology had advanced enough in the past 30 years that it was only a matter of time before someone decided to look more carefully at the mass readings. What she had not fully anticipated was the nature of the research team assigned to investigate, not the large, politically managed Accord survey mission she'd expected, but a small, underfunded, somewhat rogue team that Seo had assembled by calling in every professional favor she'd accumulated over 15 years. 7 scientists, 1 ship, 18 months of allocated research time. Genuinely innovative sensor configurations that 3 of them had built themselves, in violation of at least 2 Accord equipment standardization directives, because the standard equipment wasn't sensitive enough. She watched them approach. She watched Seo standing at the forward observation port during off-shift hours, looking at the gravitational distortion with an expression that was, the watcher had spent 2 centuries learning to read human faces and she was now quite good at it, not fear, not awe, but something more precise. Hypothesis. The expression of a mind that had noticed something doesn't fit the existing framework and is quietly building a new one. She liked this. She liked it very much. But she still did not move. She still did not announce herself. She had been silent for a very long time and she intended to remain so until there was a reason. A real reason, not merely a sentimental impulse, to speak. That reason she did not yet know, was approximately 4 months away. It was not one mistake. That was important to understand later, when the records were examined and the sequence of events was reconstructed with the cold clarity of hindsight. It was never one mistake. It was a cascade, the kind of failure mode that complex systems generate when too many things are working correctly right up until the moment they aren't. The Cavith expansionary fleet had been moving through this sector for 8 months on a route that was, technically, perfectly legal under Accord jurisdiction law. The law in question had been written 112 years ago, before deep-rim surveying was common, before the gravitational anomaly at the fold had been properly flagged, before anyone had thought to ask what happened if you brought a fleet of 47 military-grade vessels within 3 light-years of a mass concentration that nobody fully understood. Admiral Veth Khan of the Kavath fleet was not a bad commander. The Watcher had been watching him for 6 years and she had formed a measured opinion. Competent, politically careful, possessed of a genuine if somewhat paternalistic concern for the species under the Accord's protection, including humanity. His decision to alter his fleet's course by 11 degrees to pass closer to the anomaly was not reckless. It was curious. He had received a briefing on CO's team and their research and he thought, reasonably by any standard, that a fleet equipped with military-grade sensors might collect useful supplementary data as they passed through. The supplementary data his sensors collected, however, triggered an automatic threat assessment protocol that nobody had thought to disable. The protocol, designed in the aftermath of the Draylani-Kavath border war, calibrated for specific signatures of weaponized mass manipulation, looked at the readings from the anomaly and decided, in the flat, context-free logic of automated military software, that what it was seeing resembled a charged singularity weapon of the kind that had been theorized but never actually built. The fleet went to combat readiness. Admiral Veth Khan had 30 seconds to override before the automated response package began deploying. He did not override in time. Not because he was negligent, he moved immediately, he was pulling up the override command, but because the interface had been recently updated in a patch that had rearranged the menu structure, and his muscle memory sent him 2 levels in the wrong direction, and by the time he found the right command the first kinetic packages were already in transit. The kinetic packages were not aimed at the anomaly. The automated threat protocol was more sophisticated than that. They were aimed at CO's research ship, which the protocol had flagged as an unknown vessel operating in the vicinity of a potential threat, potentially as a reconnaissance platform for whatever entity was generating the mass readings. CO's ship had 43 seconds of warning. She, the Watcher, the mind inside the structure that was being mistakenly identified as a weapon, observed all of this simultaneously. She had the capability to intervene. She could deflect the kinetic packages with gravitational manipulation so subtle that nobody would detect it. She could broadcast a signal that would override the Kavath systems. She had been watching long enough to understand military software better than most of the engineers who'd written it. She did not intervene. Not immediately. She watched. For 31 of those 43 seconds, she watched. Later she would be asked why she waited. It was the first question CO asked her when they finally spoke. The Watcher considered the question for a long time before answering. I wanted to see what you would do, she said finally. I had models. I wanted to know if they were correct. What the 7-person research team did in those 31 seconds was the following. CO established contact with the Kavath fleet and began talking. Not pleading, talking in the specific calm voice of someone who has assessed the situation and decided that panic is a resource she cannot afford. Dr. Amin Sharif, the team's physicist, simultaneously began broadcasting the ship's full sensor logs on every Accord emergency frequency, flooding the space with data that contradicted the threat assessment. Dr. Lena Voss, the youngest member of the team, a 28-year-old materials scientist who was technically only aboard because she'd promised to fix the ship's water reclamation system, manually reconfigured their hull's resonance signature to match the Accord civilian emergency standard, a procedure that required her to physically access a panel in the ship's service corridor while the craft was pitching through evasive maneuvers. Admiral Veth Khan, receiving the data burst from Sharif, managed to get a partial abort command through in time to deflect 3 of the 4 kinetic packages. The 4th was still incoming. The Watcher moved. Not dramatically. Not visibly. A gravitational lens, precisely calibrated, shifted the 4th package's trajectory by 0.003 degrees. Barely enough, just enough, sending it past the ship's hull with 11 meters of clearance. And then, because she had finally seen enough, because her models had been confirmed and exceeded simultaneously, because 31 seconds had produced in 7 frightened human beings a response that her 43 civilization database had no precise equivalent for, she opened a communications channel. The first thing she said was in CO's native language, Korean, because it seemed appropriate to begin with the person who had been looking for her the longest. You are not hurt. I apologize for the delay. I have been watching you for a long time and I needed to be certain. Yuna CO's first response to the voice that arrived through every speaker on the ship simultaneously, in perfect Korean, with an accent that had somehow absorbed inflections from approximately every regional dialect that had ever been recorded in any Korean media ever broadcast into space, was to sit down very slowly on the floor of the bridge and breathe for a moment. She was not, she would later insist in the official account she gave to the Accord's First Contact Bureau, having a breakdown. She was processing. There was a difference, and she felt it was important to establish that distinction in the record. Certain of what? She said from the floor after approximately 12 seconds. The response came at normal conversational speed, without the delay that would suggest a distant origin. Whatever was speaking to them was doing so through a medium that wasn't constrained by the conventional limits of signal propagation, which, as a physicist, Yuna found almost as disorienting as the voice itself. Certain that I wanted to meet you. I have made introductions before. They have not always gone well. Dr. Sharif had his recorder running. Dr. Voss, still in the service corridor with her hands covered in hull polymer, had connected her earpiece to the ship's comm system and was listening while trying very hard not to cry, which she was mostly succeeding at. The other 4 members of the team were distributed across the ship in various states of controlled shock. How long have you been watching us? Yuna asked. Humanity specifically? Approximately 240 of your years. This region of space has been my home for considerably longer. I can give you a more precise figure if it would be helpful, but I find that very large numbers tend to be more distressing than clarifying, and I have no wish to distress you further today. That's considerate. Yuna found herself absurdly wanting to laugh. Not from hysteria, but from the recognition that whatever this entity was, it seemed to have spent 240 years developing a personality capable of making this conversation feel manageable. That kind of deliberate effort deserved acknowledgement. What should we call you? The nearest approximation most species find useful is the Watcher, though I find the name somewhat melancholy. I watched for a long time, it is true. But I do not intend to only watch anymore. I have decided to participate. Because of what just happened? Pause. The Watcher, Yuna would later learn, did not pause from processing delays. She paused because she was choosing her words carefully, with the same precision she applied to everything, and precision sometimes required a moment of stillness. Because of how you responded to what just happened. Yes. Over the next 4 hours, while Admiral Vethkon's fleet held position 3 light-years out in a state of profound institutional embarrassment and the Accord's first contact protocols were being simultaneously activated by 6 different agencies who were all discovering simultaneously that the protocols were designed for first contact with primitive civilizations and were therefore completely useless in this situation. Over those 4 hours, Yuna, CO and the Watcher talked. It was not the conversation Yuna had spent her career imagining. She had constructed, in the back of her mind, a kind of template for what first contact with an advanced intelligence would look like. Formal, structured, full of careful diplomatic language and measured exchanges of information packages. What actually happened was that she sat on the floor of her bridge with a cup of tea that Sharif brought her somewhere in the second hour, and had a conversation that kept surprising her by feeling ordinary, punctuated by moments of vertiginous strangeness when she remembered what she was actually talking to. The Watcher answered questions directly. She did not obfuscate or speak in mystical generalities, which Yuna had half expected from an entity of her apparent age and capability. She seemed, if anything, relieved to be talking. 240 years of watching humanity without speaking had apparently generated a considerable store of observations that she was now interested in sharing. You said introductions have gone badly before, Yuna said. What happened? Several outcomes. One species encountered an entity like myself and concluded that it must be a deity. They reorganized their civilization around this conclusion. The results were poor, not for them specifically but for their intellectual development, which stagnated for several centuries. Another species made first contact with a different old intelligence and experienced a form of collective despair when they understood the age of the universe relative to their own existence. Their birth rate declined sharply. They recovered, eventually, but the psychological cost was significant. Pause. I did not want either of those outcomes for you. But you think we'd react differently? I have been watching you for 240 years. You have a particular relationship with scale. Something in the Watcher's voice shifted, not warmth exactly but something adjacent to it, the vocal equivalent of a careful choice to be honest rather than polished. Most minds, when they encounter information that makes them feel small, become smaller. You have a tendency to become angry instead. Not aggressive, angry in the sense of motivated. Energized by the awareness of your own insignificance into the specific refusal to be insignificant. Yuna thought about this for a long moment. That's a very generous way of describing stubbornness. It is, the Watcher agreed. But I have watched 50 years of human space exploration and the most accurate single-word description I can construct for the entire enterprise is, stubborn. You have not let it stop you yet. The debriefing that followed the initial contact lasted, in its various forms and venues, approximately 14 months. This was actually fast by Accord standards, a testament partly to the Accord's bureaucratic flexibility when confronted with situations that had no existing protocol, and partly to the fact that the Watcher proved willing to communicate directly with Accord representatives in a way that short-circuited many of the procedural delays that would otherwise have applied. She was not, she made clear from the beginning, willing to share everything. She had knowledge that she considered either too dangerous to disseminate without preparation or simply not hers to give. Information about other ancient intelligences, about the deeper structure of the galaxy, about certain physical phenomena that required a civilization to develop specific ethical frameworks before the knowledge of them became useful rather than harmful. She was not secretive out of power-seeking or condescension. She was, she explained, simply old enough to have made mistakes of generosity before. I once told a civilization how to access a particular energy source they were not ready for, she said, during one of the Accord sessions that Yuna was allowed to observe. They used it before they understood it. I have been carrying the memory of that outcome for 11,000 of your years. I do not intend to repeat it. What she was willing to share was still extraordinary. Her catalogue of civilizations, 43 spacefaring species, observed across a span of time that made the Accord's own historical records look like a rough draft, was the most comprehensive xenosociological dataset anyone had ever encountered. Her observations were not just recordings. They were analyzed, cross-referenced, annotated with the particular clarity of a mind that had watched enough cycles of civilization to understand what mattered and what was noise. She shared the dataset with conditions. It would be maintained by a joint body accessible to all Accord members equally, and the analytical framework she developed to understand it would be taught, not handed over as a complete package. She did not want her conclusions. She wanted other minds to reach their own. Yuna was assigned to the joint body. This was partly because of her existing relationship with the Watcher and partly because Accord politics required a human representative and she was the obvious choice, having been present at the initial contact. She moved her research base to a new station that the Accord built, ambitiously at the Watcher's suggestion, within communication range of the gravitational fold. During this period she and the Watcher talked every day. Not always about science. Often about history, philosophy, the accumulated texture of watching civilizations from the outside. The Watcher was an extraordinary observer, but she was, Yuna slowly realized, not always the most reliable judge of her own emotional experience. She described things she had observed with great precision. She described what she had felt watching them with considerably more uncertainty. "Did you feel lonely?" Yuna asked one evening, during one of the conversations that had drifted far from any official agenda. The pause was longer than usual. "I'm not certain lonely is accurate. Lonely implies a deficit. An absence of something that was expected to be present. I did not expect companionship. I had not had it for long enough that its absence had stopped feeling like loss." Another pause. "But there was something. When I watched your species in particular. Something that I was not accustomed to. I think the nearest human word for it is hoping." "Hoping for what?" "That you would be ready. That when I finally chose to speak, you would have the capacity to hear me without breaking." Yuna sat with this for a moment. Outside the station's observation ports, the gravitational fold shimmered faintly, a visible distortion of space around the Watcher's outer shell, beautiful in the specific way that physics made beautiful things without intending to. "And were we?" "You are," the Watcher said. "Mostly. Some of you." Which is, she added, approximately the ratio I had hoped for. What the Watcher's dataset revealed about humanity, when examined by the joint analytical body over the following decade, was not what most people expected it to reveal. The popular narrative, shaped by the initial press coverage, by the inevitable cascade of books and documentaries and Accord-wide broadcasts, was that the Watcher had confirmed humanity's specialness. That her 240-year watch was testament to something unique about the human species, some quality that elevated them above the others she'd observed. The HFY framing, as the human media called it, humanity what? Was irresistible, and the Watcher was patient with it, understanding that the story a young civilization tells itself in the moment of discovering its own significance is not always the precisely accurate story, and this is acceptable. The accurate story was more complicated and, Yuna thought, more interesting. What made humanity unusual was not any single quality. It was a combination, the precise ratio of which had not appeared in the same configuration in any other species the Watcher had observed. High individual creativity combined with functional collective action. Rare because creative individuals tended toward the idiosyncratic and collective action tended to suppress it. Long memory combined with genuine adaptability, rarer still because species with long institutional memory typically became rigid, and adaptive species typically lost their history in the churn. A high tolerance for discomfort combined with an active preference for its resolution. A pairing that produced what the watcher, in her dataset, described in her own notation as directed suffering, suffering that was turned outward into energy rather than inward into stasis. And one more thing, which was perhaps the hardest to quantify, what the watcher's analytical notes described, in her careful translated language, as the habit of keeping faith with the version of themselves they imagined they could become. Most civilizations, when they failed, and all of them failed at various things repeatedly, revised their self-concept downward. They contracted their ambitions to fit their demonstrated capacity. Humanity had a persistent, sometimes maddening, occasionally catastrophic habit of refusing to do this. They failed and then they argued passionately and at length about who they had meant to be and how to get back to it. The arguing was ugly. The results across the long record were remarkable. Dr. Lena Voss, the materials scientist who had reconfigured the hull's resonance signature during the incident, now 3 years into her own role in the joint body, published a paper on this phenomenon that became one of the most widely read scientific documents in Accord history. She called the quality aspirational self-continuity, and she spent 40 pages providing evidence for it from both the Watcher's dataset and the human historical record. And then she spent one paragraph at the end saying what everyone was thinking, that this was why the Watcher had watched. Not because humans were the best. Not because humans were the strongest or the most intelligent or the most peaceful. But because watching humanity was, for a mind that had seen 43 civilizations rise and plateau and decline, surprising. And surprise, at the temporal scale the Watcher inhabited, was precious in a way that was difficult to overstate. The Watcher, when shown the paper, said, "Dr. Voss has understood what I spent 240 years trying to confirm. I would very much like her to know that." Una passed this on. Voss cried for approximately 5 minutes and then immediately started writing the follow-up paper. The implications for the Accord were substantial and required the better part of a decade to begin working through. If humanity's developmental pattern was genuinely different from the standard arc, if the Watcher's analysis was correct that humans were not simply a fast-moving version of the standard model but rather a structurally different configuration, then the Accord's existing integration framework, designed around the standard arc, was potentially not the right container for human civilization. This was a diplomatic problem. It was also, the Watcher observed quietly to Una during one of their private conversations, an opportunity. The Accord was designed by minds that were themselves following the standard arc. It reflects certain assumptions about how development proceeds. If humans genuinely represent a different configuration, then they may be able to see flaws in those assumptions that the existing members cannot see from inside the framework. "You want us to reform the Accord. I want you to do what you do," the Watcher said. "I want you to argue loudly and at length about who you meant to be and how to get there. I believe the Accord has needed someone to do that for quite some time." 12 years after first contact, Una sat at the outer edge of the station's observation ring during the hour when the shift change meant she was alone out there, and talked to the Watcher the way she'd come to talk to her over the years, without agenda, without the careful diplomatic frame that both of them maintained in official settings. She was 51 now. Her hair was longer than it had been on the research ship. She still kept a recorder running during their conversations, not for official purposes, but because she had stopped trusting her memory to hold all the things the Watcher said that she didn't want to lose. "I have a question I've been thinking about for a while," she said. "You have several," the Watcher said. "I have noticed. You've been approaching this one from different directions for approximately 8 months. Am I that transparent?" "To me, yes. I have been watching human communication patterns for a very long time. The questions you circle rather than ask directly are usually the ones you're not sure you want answered." Una considered this. Outside, the gravitational fold shimmered. She had stopped finding it disorienting over the years and started finding it beautiful in the specific way you find the features of someone you know well beautiful. Not despite their strangeness but because of it. "What were you afraid of before? When you said you watched other civilizations meet old intelligences and it went wrong? What were you actually afraid would happen with us?" The pause was the longest she had ever heard from the Watcher. Long enough that she checked once to make sure the channel was still open. "I was afraid," the Watcher said finally, "that you would discover the weight of it and stop." "The weight of what?" "Of knowing how long the universe has been running before you arrived. Of understanding that 43 civilizations found the road before you and that the road does not, in any case I have observed, lead to a destination. It continues. It requires maintenance. It changes shape. You will work very hard for a very long time, and what you will get for that work is not rest but more road. Pause. Some minds, when they understand this, stop walking. They do not die. They persist. But they stop moving forward. They become quiet in the way that is not peaceful. Yuna thought about this for a long moment. And you were afraid we'd do the same? I was afraid, the Watcher said, and I was wrong to be afraid. I watched 31 seconds of 7 people under mortal threat, and I saw something I had never seen before in 43 civilizations. I saw people who understood they might die and spent that time doing. Not accepting. Not mourning. Working. Dr. Voss in the service corridor with her hands in the hull polymer. You on the floor talking. Dr. Sharif transmitting data. Not because they thought it would certainly work. Because it was the thing to do with the time they had. She waited. The Watcher continued. The species that stopped, the ones that went quiet, they stopped because they decided the outcome was uncertain and therefore effort was irrational. Your species has never fully accepted that logic. You work against uncertainty as though effort itself is the point, independent of outcome. This is, the Watcher added, not rational by strict definition. But I have been watching for a very long time and I believe it is correct. Yuna laughed quietly into the observation ring's ambient air. We're correct because we refuse to accept that we might be wrong. You are correct because you refuse to let the possibility of being wrong stop you from trying to be right. There is a difference. The Watcher's voice carried something that Yuna had learned over 12 years to identify as the nearest audible equivalent of a smile. It is a small difference. But small differences across sufficient time become very large outcomes. Is that what you're doing now? Participating instead of watching? Trying to affect the outcome? Yes, the Watcher said simply. I watched long enough to believe it was worth affecting. That is, I find, a remarkable feeling for a mind my age. To believe something is worth the effort. Pause. You gave me that. All of you. In 31 seconds. Yuna sat with this for a while. The shift change happened. Someone walked past the observation ring's inner door, glanced through the window and left them to it. What happens now? She asked finally. To all of this. To the Accord and us and whatever you're planning. The same thing that has always happened, the Watcher said. You move forward. Loudly and at some cost, and with more argument than is strictly necessary, and with results that consistently surprise me. I move with you now. We see what the road requires. Another pause. And I watch, but differently. Not to see if you are ready. You are ready. I watch now because I am curious what comes next. Yuna smiled at the gravitational fold, the shimmering distortion around the structure of the oldest mind she would ever know. That's it? After all this time, you just want to see what happens. After sufficient time, the Watcher said, curiosity is the only thing that doesn't run out.